Hello everybody and welcome to this video looking at Sekiro, the latest FromSoftware developed game. This one's been published by Activision, comes out in about a month, and I've had a chance to get some hands-on time with it. I believe this is a demo that Activision has been showing around for a fair while now, and it's been at some conventions and so on, so a fair few people would have played it, but this is actually my first hands-on with it, my first time with the game, and I thought I'd just share some thoughts and some footage of me playing it, so people who haven't seen it yet can get a feel for it and share my initial thoughts about the game, because this is a big one for me. I'm a huge fan of FromSoftware's Dark Souls and Bloodborne series, and I'm an even bigger fan of Nioh, which Koei Tecmo produced very much in the vein of the Soulsborne formula, and I was a little bit concerned going into Sekiro, I must admit, not because I thought the game would be bad by any means, I always assumed it would be quite good, but as it's set in exactly the same period of Nioh, and I'm such a fan of Nioh, I was worried that I'd be making a comparison, a direct comparison between what Koei's done and this game. Luckily, this game actually has a lot to it that is quite different to Nioh, and indeed the Dark Souls and Bloodborne series before it, so I think it really stands on its own, and people who go in trying to play it just like a Souls game will find it a very different experience, to say the least. So in this demo I was able to take on 3 different bosses and explore a little bit of the world and get a sense for what is involved. This is the first boss that you're seeing here in front of you. It's a samurai general, as his name suggests. And a couple of things that I noticed very early on. Firstly, this game is still very difficult. As anybody who's played a Souls game knows, they can be very unforgiving and punishing. This one doesn't have the stamina meter that both the Souls games and Nioh have, so you can basically attack away forever and not get tired. And at first I thought that would remove some of the strategy effort, but it doesn't, because actually this is a very fast-paced action-based combat system, and the enemy bosses have a very large range of attacks. This is the first one that you come across, and he's got what feels like more than a dozen different attack patterns to actually try and memorize or counter, and I found it very difficult. I didn't actually beat this boss in my play time today, which is impressive, because I have been able to finish the Nioh and Souls games. I found the speed of action in this one different, and it took me a while to get the hang of it or get a feel for it, and I was making all kinds of silly mistakes as I was playing through, because I was also trying to rush through because I wanted to see as much as possible in the time I had. So yes, didn't manage to beat this guy. One of the other things that really makes this combat system interesting and quite difficult to deal with is the fact that if you take all the health out of an enemy boss, as I have here, that doesn't actually kill him. Firstly, you need to then, once all their health is gone, you need to then figure out how to stun them so that you can do a death blow, and even then they have multiple lives. So the samurai general that you saw me fight just then actually has 2 lives, so you have to stun him, you have to remove all his health, stun him, then kill him, and then he comes back to life, and you have to do that all over again. So it is a very different system to the Souls games, where if you defeated an enemy and they died, that was it. The boss, even the bosses, once they ran out of health, that was it, they were over. So actually, the first time I managed to get all the health out of the samurai general, I actually put the controller down because I was quite excited for beating him without realizing that he had a second life, and yeah, I quickly died after that, because these boss battles, they only need to hit you a couple of times and that's it for you. So you've got to be very, very careful about how you go about the fighting as well. But then I discovered one thing which I really like about this game. You don't actually have to defeat this samurai general at all. If you want, you can run straight past him, which is what I do here, so I can continue on. I don't know how many of the bosses you'll be able to do that with and how many bosses you can avoid, but out of the 3 bosses in this demo alone, I was able to run past one, and I was able to stealth kill a second, so that I never actually had to fight them. It was only the third that I wasn't able to figure out a way around, and maybe you can't, maybe you can, maybe you can't. But I found it really impressive that you have the option, and the game gives you the option of how to go about playing it. It's not as open as Dark Souls, or at least this section of the game doesn't feel as open as Dark Souls. It feels like you're on a much more linear path and you've got to follow it. But what you actually have in terms of options on how to go about the challenges is quite significant, it's got to be said. As you're about to see in the footage, where I do sneak around and I do stealth kill a boss. That's something that you couldn't really do in Dark Souls. You sometimes had the opportunity to take out a big bit of their health by dive attacking them from the air or sneak attacking them or whatever, but it was very difficult to actually defeat them in one hit. And I think that shows a bit of confidence on the part of FromSoftware, because if they made it obviously too easy to go around stealth killing everything, then there wouldn't be too much of a challenge in the game. People would kind of figure out how to game it. But I think by allowing people to stealth kill the occasional boss, as they have, it gives you that sense that your decisions matter and you can adjust how you play the game to the way that you kind of want. And that's important too, because this game doesn't have the RPG systems that Dark Souls does, or at least I don't think it does. I didn't see any menu options or anything to go and level up characters. There doesn't seem to be any kind of experience system. You've got the prosthetic arm, which you can add new abilities to, but you can't level your character up as far as I can tell. So while you have those kind of typical systems for an action game of improving your character by getting them better equipment or getting them new abilities to play around with, it doesn't seem to have that leveling system, which, again, I found to be quite interesting. Another thing that I found to be quite interesting is the way that the game handles death. As the subtitle is Shadows Die Twice, or Shadows Die Twice. Once your character dies, you actually have the chance to bring them back, and if you can then kill a certain number of enemies after bringing them back, they get that life back as well. And that's a really clever thing, because obviously in Dark Souls or whatever, if you died, then you'd have to go back to a save point and start again. This gives you some kind of chance to turn things around, and I really like that. It keeps the game fluid and moving forwards, which I think a lot of people had an issue with Dark Souls. As much as the game is great and as popular as it was, or is, there is a sense for some people, I think, that you can get very stuck. And it seems to me that the developer has worked really hard by giving you options about how to defeat the bosses. You can bypass them entirely, and the ability to have a second chance at something before having to go back to a save point and start again. I think the developer's done a really good job in giving you every opportunity, despite the difficulty of the game, to keep the pace of the game moving forwards, which I really like. I was really impressed by that. Now, the section of the game that you see in front of you right now is a bit of an exploration section. There is a huge thing that you're about to see me come up against. If it spots you, it's basically a game over. I don't believe there's any way of fighting it. But maybe you do down the track, maybe you don't, I don't know. Again, this seems to be a very small slice of the game, and I was limited to how far I could go, but it just goes to show you some of the vision of the kind of monstrous that FromSoftware had with the Dark Souls series, more than hangs around, to say the least. I was a little bit, not concerned, but I went into this game thinking that the emphasis on mythology would be a little bit lighter, because it is set in a real period of history as opposed to a fantasy world, and that real period of history has plenty of interesting characters in its own right and plenty of interesting settings and things. I wasn't sure if they felt the need to throw monsters in, but they have. At least one monster. Hopefully it's not the only one, because it's a pretty impressive monster. You need to stealth past him, you need to hide in a wall, you need to make sure he doesn't see you. It's a giant snake. But yeah, that's another element, I guess, to it. I was, as a huge fan of Japanese history, and I said this in a previous video I did about Sekiro, I was really keen to see how they worked with their real history. This is obviously a Japanese company. The Sengoku period, which is where this game is set, is a very well-known period of Japanese history, and students learn about it and all that kind of stuff. So I knew that the team at FromSoftware would have a very intimate knowledge about this period of history and the characters involved and all that kind of thing, but how they actually executed on that was always going to be something that was interesting to be seen. And that's one area where this game really does differ to Nioh as well. Nioh was much more involved with the mythology of Japanese culture and history, so it was very much about the Oni and the demons and that kind of fantasy side of things, or to go with, I guess, the historical characters that you came across as well. This one is a little bit more grounded in what seems to be, obviously it's a very idealized history, but it seems to be a little bit more realistic in the sense that you're not fighting a horror world of demons and stuff. The last boss I got to fight against absolutely ruined me. I did not beat him, so if you're keeping score, I only beat one of the 3 bosses, and that was through a stealth kill. I've got a lot to learn about this game, obviously, but this last boss is a monk fella, and he's a difficult battle. He has 3 lives that can come back, so you've got to defeat him 3 times around. And he has this huge reach weapon, and you're fighting on a fairly thin bridge, so your room to move is limited. He does have a weakness to fire, as I discovered, so that firing weapon that I have there does more damage to him than if I didn't have the firing weapon, but it still was nowhere near enough to beat him. So this is still very early on in the game too, it must be said. So people who go in expecting a challenge will get it. People who maybe this is their first FromSoftware game should expect to find this quite difficult, I imagine. And I'm not sure there's even a multiplayer mode in here. I don't think that's been confirmed, or if it has, I missed it. But I suspect this is actually more focused on the single player, so you can't even rely on other people to come in and help you out of these difficult battles. This is going to be one which is really going to test your skills in action games. But there is a huge sense of reward. It's a very beautiful game, as you can see, and I do think that this is going to be one of the highlights of 2019. I think this is going to be a game that is going to be very well remembered, and I think FromSoftware's done a really good job. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're pumped for the game. Of course, I will have a full review of it when it gets closer to release. But for now, let's just look forward to Sekiro.